listening to another episode of the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview Margaret Agard. Margaret is the author of the In His Footsteps series of memoirs, of which 2 books have been published, with a 3rd book soon to be published. I'm here with Margaret Agard. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes.
Who is the author of the In His Footsteps memoir series. Margaret, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Hi, Aaron. Happy to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, I have been writing for about 20 years, and I have 2 published books and 1 I'm working on. I stay in the memoir genre. And I've learned a lot about writing memoir by reading them and going to writers' groups and writers' conferences. And so I'm ready to specifically focus on memoir.
Without spoiling too much about the first 2 books in your In His Footsteps series, as those are the 2 that are currently out right now. Is that correct?
Yes.
What are both of the books that are currently out right now about?
The first one is about giving my to-do list to God, or higher power, or whatever term people use, and how it changed my life as a result, and the experiences I had as a result. And the second one is when my husband and I sold or gave away all that we had and spent 4 years serving as missionaries, usually doing service around the country, working in prisons, being in small villages, things like that.
Now, without spoiling too much about the upcoming 3rd book in your In His Footsteps series, what is that book about?
That is when I met and married my second husband. It was, I was given the direction or promise from God that I would be meeting the man I would marry the following fall, in spring of one year. And I thought, no, thank you. I had teenage sons at home. I could just see I just didn't see where that would work. And yet I did meet and marry Parker. And for a match made in heaven, it wasn't looking good to start. And so then I was given a promise that all in our families would be healed as a result of this marriage. And that is what kept me in the marriage, and where we actually did find healing. And our children will say the same thing, that our marriage was healing to them.
Now, are the books in the In His Footsteps series self-published or traditionally published?
The first 2 were self-published. We actually owned a publishing company for other items we were publishing. And my husband has been in the print industry for years, and I was in marketing and sales. So that's what we did with the first 2. With the 3rd one, I will be looking for a publisher.
And that's kind of interesting because usually I think a lot of people would expect an entire series to be either traditionally published in its entirety or self-published in its entirety, not self-published for part of the series and then traditionally published for another part of the series.
I think that's the difference between memoir and a fictional series. So a fictional series, we have a character following an arc that continues. And with memoir, I would say it's more like looking at a diamond and different crystals of it, different parts of it. And so the one is looking at our to-do list, the other is looking at our mission, the third is looking at our marriage. And that I could see would work with a traditional publisher, maybe even better than self-publishing. So, it's not quite like Harry Potter.
Just to give an example of a fiction series where you kind of have to read the books in sequence to know what's going on.
Right.
Now, if you have a normal writing routine, what is that like for you?
Well, normal is usually about 4 in the morning. When I wake up and can't sleep, I come out and write. That's what I do. Now, editing, once it's written, I can do that during the day. And so I will allow 2 hours during the day to just sit and work on the book, do editing, make things better.
Now, is it true that you have a daily practice of contemplative prayer?
Yeah, so centering prayer or contemplative prayer, I would say, relates to meditation, Christian meditation. And it's an ancient practice where a person sits and connects to God or the Holy Spirit or the higher power and sits in silence and waits for anything that the higher power might want to say, or just sits. And like meditation, constantly clearing your mind, constantly just focusing on a breath or a thought.
Yeah, I did have how contemplative Christian prayer differs from other forms of Christian prayer as part of that question, but a lot of people, the first thing they think of when they hear the term Christian prayer is a congregation, or for Catholics, Mass.
Yes. Well, contemplative prayer actually is from the 3rd and 4th century of the Catholic Church, where contemplatives, as I said, will just sit and seek to connect with the Holy Spirit and sit in silence and wait forever, whatever the Holy Spirit wants to do. Sometimes we just sit in silence the whole time and I feel the love, and other times I've had thoughts come. In my morning prayer and study routine, I think of that as my time, where I go with my questions and my journals and my scriptures. And in the evening, when I'm doing contemplative prayer, I think of that as his time. Like, whatever he wants to do with it, it's his.
Now, do you consider yourself to be more spiritual than religious, or more religious than spiritual?
I would say it was my religion that taught me about spirituality. And it was my religion that gave me the tools to have a spiritual life. And so I am religious and spiritual, but my main focus is on that spiritual connection with God or the divine.
Now, pivoting back to the memoir genre of literature, what is your best advice to someone who is either writing their first memoir or wants to write their first memoir?
First, you can have more than one memoir. I think people try to get it all into one memoir. A memoir is not an autobiography. It's a slice of your life. And second, for a lot of people who are writing memoir, they are doing it as a healing process. They want to get it out there. They've gone through a traumatic childhood. They've been through a disease. They've worked or taken care of someone who's going through a disease. Or they've done something unusual. They've taken trips that people might not have. And so I'm just going to point out, too, Danny Shapiro has written 4 New York Times best-selling memoirs, each on a different subject. And I think Anne Lamott, for people of a certain age, she is still writing what is basically memoir, and has, half a dozen out there. So what I would say is write everything you can when you're thinking about it, when you're in the emotion of the moment you're remembering. And then once that is done, then you can start to shape and organize it into a memoir. And keep in mind, you can have more than one. So if one of the stories or experiences you wrote ends up not fitting in the first memoir, you might keep it for another.
Now, prior to becoming an author, you worked as a high-tech industry executive. Is that correct?
Yes, I worked with a software company.
What was it like for you, and did your experience working for a software company help you in any way when you started writing books?
Did it help me in any way? Well, I organized, and I know how to write. And Well, it was my life for a long time. So some of what I write, it was reflected. That is reflected in that. Things I learned from being an executive and working with people.
Yeah, I apologize if that question came across as rather awkward to you.
No, I just haven't ever had to answer that one, Aaron. Good question. So I had to think. I think, how did that experience affect me? And one is that I knew I could try new things and figure it out. Well, that's pretty standard in the software industry, especially during the time I was in it, which was when the PCs were first coming out and everything was new and all companies were new and we were all growing and we all had to try new things and learn a lot. And writing has that same impact. And second, I was used to going to conferences, and so going to writers' conferences just struck me as a natural thing to do since I had been going to business conferences for years.
Yeah, back in the, you were like a software industry executive back in the 1980s when the IBM PC was coming out. The Apple II had been out for a few years. The Commodore came out with the VIC-20 and the 64 that were very popular in that era.
Yes. And through the 1990s, I kind of retired, not because of my age, but just because of a change in circumstances around 1995. And so, yes, I was with a lot of startup firms, just a lot of growth.
Yeah, my older brother learned how to use a computer on an old Commodore VIC-20, and now he works for CenturyLink in the Columbus, Ohio area.
Oh, good. Yes, that's the one with that had the lights on the side, right? Or maybe you could connect a printer to it. Print things out. Yeah.
Well, Margaret, you've been a wonderful guest for this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thanks, Aaron.
Margaret was a wonderful guest for this podcast. Before I sign off for this episode, I'll provide a status update regarding my health and this podcast. I have some more episodes on this podcast forthcoming over the next week or so. Then on March 16th, I'm going to undergo oral surgery to remove my lower left wisdom tooth, which is the last of my wisdom teeth that I still have. During the second half of this month, I will be going on medical leave from this podcast for the second half of March while I recover from oral surgery. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.